And also in the middle of all this, I get a phone call and it's the doctor. Anyway. All right, so let me see if I can get this going over here. Yes, okay, so remind me not to try to use Streamlabs again because it just never works right. So let me see if I can get myself pulled up over here so I can get going and we can start reading. I really am enjoying this book that I'm reading, so this is where I'm live at. Okay, there we go, okay. Now, the only thing about this right here, because I think this is just like a webcam live kind of a thing. Anyway, here we go. All right, so I'm going to start reading back where we left off, okay, because I only have a little bit of time today, especially after being late because of the dang. So where we're going to start off is called part 2. Look at that terrible glare. All right, this is going to be part 2. All right, here we go. Now, and I know it's weird to come over to this because I want to do more, a variety of live things on my other channel and just keep the reading over here because it gets all, confusing, all that. So this chapter it starts off called Pops of Color. Okay, it's actually chapter 7. I didn't realize we'd gotten that far. So here we go, chapter 7. Okay, so let me get back over here and get comfortable and so we can just start reading. All right. Street lights reflected off the black asphalt as I sped down Sunset Boulevard. Without the sun, the temperature had plummeted, and I was only wearing shorts and a t-shirt. I gotta turn this one down over here. Let me get this one here. All right, there we go. All right. But as I reached to turn up the heat, I knew how to do it. The car wasn't mine. I pulled over and scanned the dash until I found the temperature controls. I'd stolen the car several hours earlier, and I'd been so busy zipping around the late-night streets of Los Angeles that I hadn't yet figured out the buttons. But now the thrill of what I'd done was gone. I just felt cold and detached and impatient. The Vince whirred when I found the right button. Hot air just rushed through the slats, and I leaned back, grateful to be warm. The dashboard clock ticked into midnight and reminded me I was once again breaking dormitory curfews. I sighed and looked at the ceiling, wondering if I would ever care about that curfew, wondering if I would ever care about anything. The possibility, at least, was entertaining. My mood began to rise along with the temperature. For a few minutes, I simply sat there, parked in front of that CVS. On the passenger seat was the car owner's wallet. I grabbed it, and I chose one of his credit cards inside. Then I got out of the car and walked into the store, warming up again as my next adventure unfolded. It had been 6 months since I'd left home for college, and nothing was going according to plan. Now she's stolen a car. Oh boy. I decided to apply to UCLA during my junior year of high school. It was a bit late to apply to an out-of-state school. My guidance counselor, Mr. Rodriguez, had snipped. I was sitting across from a woman at the desk. Behind her was a framed poster of a man standing in front of several Lamborghinis. It was captioned, "Justification for Higher Education," and I wanted to throw it out the window. She looked at my grades and commented, "Out-of-state applicants are advised to start the process early." I already hated Mr. Rodriguez. Her preference for Eastern-hued, ill-fitting pantsuits just notwithstanding. I could tell she was an aggressive rule follower. She was also deeply pessimistic, the worst possible combination. Actually, I said excitedly, my dad lives in California, so I'll be considered in-state. I hadn't said this to be argumentative, but Mrs. Rodriguez just wanted to slap me. She shifted in her seat and began to toy with a caterpillar-shaped rhinestone pin that gleamed hideously from her purple lapel. "Well, I don't know about any of that," she remarked, "but I don't think there's any sense in applying to UCLA this late in the game. And certainly not when you've got so many excellent schools right in your own backyard. After all, how would you feel if you found out a California student was applying to the University of Florida as an in-state candidate?" she asked. I was 100% certain I wouldn't care at all. Nor was I about to take advice from a woman whose idea of success was serial purchases of outdated sports cars. But I wasn't going to get into that with Miss Rodriguez. My choice to attend UCLA had nothing to do with the academics and everything to do with the distance. As a teenager approaching adulthood, I wasn't any closer to figuring out what made me so different. But worse, I hadn't been able to figure out less destructive ways of dealing with it. I knew I'd been lucky so far. Between late night stalkings and empty house explorations, I'd managed to find secret outlets, for my darkness throughout most of the middle and high school. But the balancing act was different. In the small conservative town where I lived, it was only a matter of time before my luck had ran out. What I need is a big city, I thought. Imagine a place where invisibility wouldn't require constant effort, somewhat or somewhere I could hide in plain sight. Then one night it occurred to me Los Angeles, the city where my father now lived, and afforded me a luxury I'd only ever dreamed of automatic obscurity. With its vast geography and millions of residents, I could be anyone I wanted to in LA. I could just blend in, I could disappear. My mother wasn't thrilled with the idea of me moving all the way across the country for school, but for multiple reasons, I was insistent. Although I loved my family, I knew I had to get away from them for their sake as much as mine. This was particularly the case for my sister, whose ability to see through my good grid, her veneer had become cause for concern. Look at this, she said to me one afternoon. It was Saturday, and we were in the den. Harlow was on the couch drawing in her sketchbook while I played the video games. My sister loved to draw and had blossomed into an exceptional cartoonist. She slid her latest work in front of me, a character she created. In the center of the page, she had drawn a large A and a masked female, a superhero wearing a cape. She called it Captain Apathy. It was captioned for the untruth, injustice, and the anarchist way. That's a little funny, isn't it? It is. She makes me laugh. I studied the image of the Cape Crusader and the words she added and added to the speech bubble above her head. Never fear, she said. Captain Apathy doesn't care. Whoa, I said quietly. I was uncharacteristically speechless. Harlow grinned. It's you, she said proudly, my favorite superhero, Cat. Then she skipped off happily into the kitchen to prepare her favorite snack. Delicately microwaved Chips Ahoy cookies. I sat there and I stared darkly at that cartoon. I may not have known what made it so different from everyone else, but I did know that I was no superhero. If anything, Harlow was my superhero. She's just a naturally good person. She didn't have any demons to slay or secrets to keep or destructive urges to navigate. It was almost as if we were born, I was accidentally given an extra dose of darkness, her dose, whereas I was gifted with the prediction for mischief. Harlow was gifted with the pure lightness. I'd always known the differences between us were stark, but Captain Apathy just made it obvious I wasn't the only one who noticed. Fortunately, college provided an ideal solution. If I moved away, I knew I would no longer have to worry about hiding from my mother or rubbing off on my sister. I could live a life on my own terms without anything to rebel against. I wondered, would my destructive urges go away? I suspected they would. Maybe then I could just be normal. The words entered my consciousness one night like a lightning bolt, and I couldn't chase them away. The idea of such a life, one not bogged down by dark urges or rising tensions, just was never far from my thoughts. It was something I'd cautiously wondering for as long as I could remember, but I'd always known better than to get my hopes up until then. Maybe once I get to college, things will be different. I hope so. Initially, that was the case. Life in Los Angeles was so blissful. It was just normal even. Dad picked me up from the airport that day, and I spent the following weeks exploring UCLA and getting me settled into my dorm. My room was on the second floor of a covered sorority house overlooking Hilliard Avenue. It had floor-to-ceiling French doors and a tiny decorative balcony, the only one in the house. I loved it. I had the place to myself for the first few days. I had a suite mate. Her name was written in chalk next to mine. It was on the door, but I had no idea who she was or when she was planning to arrive. As the days crept by, I held out hope she might not actually appear. But my dreams of solitary living were dashed when the day before classes started, the door flew open and a stunning Chinese girl, lugging several large suitcases, stepped across the threshold. "Hi, I'm Patrique," I said carefully. The girl stared at me with beautiful, wide almond eyes, and then she reached into her enormous purse. After digging for several seconds, she found a small silver box, roughly the size of a graphing calculator. It had a speaker on the end and a microphone on the other end. She spoke quickly into the box. Her Mandarin message converted to English by a monotone male voice. It just erupted forcefully from the speaker, and it says, "Nice to meet you. I'm Kimmy." A translator? I stared at the magic box. "You take this everywhere you go?" The box communicated my message to Kimmy, who nodded enthusiastically. Kimmy was an international student. She'd never been to the United States and didn't speak English. A translator? "Yes, Kimmy, a machine." She patted the box. "Well, it's nice to meet you, Kimmy," I said. Then I took the box. "And you as well, machine." A room with a view and a roommate who can't talk to me. I thought. Life couldn't have been more perfect. At first, I was happily overwhelmed with the classes and the coursework. I enjoyed being busy. When I wasn't studying or sitting in class, I was exploring the campus. My heavy course load, combined with the novelty of my environment, drained every ounce of my brain power. Each night I collapsed into my bed and fell into a deep sleep, only to wake the next morning refreshed and relaxed. It was wonderful. It was powerful. It was normal. But it didn't last very long. After the first semester, things slowed down. No longer consumed by the busyness of acclimation, I found myself drawn into familiar feelings. I could sense the mounting pressure and the acute stress that always seemed to accompany it. I still had my newfound freedom, but the peace was gone. Without enough to distract me, I realized that my destructive urges were still very much there. And without the convenience of my childhood bedroom window, I guess I'd come up with some other creative outlets. Captain Apathy, I said. I was leaning against the wall, overlooking the quad outside my dorm, waiting for the sun to get set. Beneath the hillside descended along the most. Descended. Okay, I gotta start on that one. Beneath me, the hillside descended along the most of the campus. I'd come to love this view, especially in the late afternoons when the California sky turned everything blood orange. Some guys were skateboarding on the landing below. I saw one take a nasty fall and rip open his knee. Several bystanders rushed to aid and helped him to his feet, but I just stared. "Never fear, Captain Apathy doesn't care," I whispered. I sighed and tilted my face toward the disappearing light. She goes, "I'm a paradox," was all I could think. I didn't care about anything except the fact that I didn't care. And that made me feel like finding someone to stab. But at least now I had a better understanding as to why. Psychology was my favorite class that first year. I'd always struggled to understand my own antisocial behaviors and thought taking this class might give me some insight. But just how much insight? Well, I never could have imagined. Our professor was Dr. Slack, a psychologist I liked from the start. The class was a survey that started with an introduction to the normal psyche. Most people that she taught us are born with a wide range of emotions, and individuals' mental health and propensity for abnormal behavior are largely based on the appropriateness of their emotional responses. Well, now that's kind of an interesting thing to say. Okay. People who demonstrate extreme reactions and behaviors are sometimes diagnosed as having mental illness or personality disorder. But what's important is that the extremes extend into both directions. We learned that in addition to those who experience too much emotion, there are others who experience too little. Their personality types are not categorized by the presence of feeling, but by the absence. Not surprising, these were the personality types that interested me the most. Apathy. Apathy is another term for the lack of feeling, Dr. Slack told us. It was a month or so into class, and we had ventured into the subject of antisocial psychology. Apathy is the hallmark trait of many of the antisocial disorders, she says. Take sociopath as for instance. Here we go, because she's learning that this is exactly what she is. But this is before she's actually diagnosed, though. Oh boy. Take a sociopath, for instance. Dr. Slack paused and wrote the word on the chalkboard. Sociopathy is a disorder characterized by disinclination to empathize with others. She continued, psychology speaking, sociopaths aren't well versed in compassion. They don't experience guilt like everyone else. They don't process emotion like everyone else. They don't feel like everyone else. And I think it's the lack of feeling, many researchers believe, that causes them to behave aggressively and destructively. The sociopath's subconscious desire to feel is what forces him to act out. I was spellbound. It was the first time I had ever heard someone actively explain the term. Officer Bobby had used it to describe the men in prison, and for nearly a decade I tried to find the definition. Over the years, it had become a game. Whenever I came across a dictionary, I'd search for sociopath, but every time I was disappointed. Either the word wasn't there or the definition offered no meaningful insight. It was like I didn't exist, but I always knew it was real, and now here it is. Dr. Slack's lecture may as well have been about me as far as I was concerned, and I couldn't soak up the information quickly enough. Granted, I knew this was not a normal reaction. Most non-sociopaths, I understand now, would not be flooded with relief to find themselves identifying as one. But I was thrilled. I'd always longed for some sort of evidence that I wasn't alone in this validation, that I wasn't the only person in the world who didn't feel things like everyone else. I'd always suspected, but now I knew for sure. There were enough people like me to justify an entire psychological category. And we weren't bad or evil or crazy. We were just a harder time with feelings. We acted out to fill a void. Suddenly it was all so simple. The pressure I experienced my entire life was most likely caused by my own subconscious drive for feeling. It wasn't some insurgent that needed to be eradicated. It was more like a psychological software, a patch for my brain applied to contrast my lack of emotion. My bad acts were, in fact, a type of self-preservation. This contradicted my apathy. This counteracted my apathy. My internal emotion world, like Harlow's Captain Apathy sketch, was in black and white. Doing something I knew was morally unacceptable was a way to force pop of color. Which is why on the night during my first year at UCLA, I found myself cruising the streets of Los Angeles in a stolen car. Now that's bad. The owner was a sloppy drunk, a frat boy named Mike, heir to the potato chip dynasty. He was not my first victim. In the second half of the first year, going to fraternity parties and borrowing cars had become something of a go-to feeling finder. Though the first time it happened had been entirely serendipitous. I'd gone to Saturday night mixer at the Sigma Phi Epsilon house a few weeks before Christmas break. I'd been feeling punchy. By then I understood the consequences of letting the pressure build unabated, and I was annoyed with myself for having let it fester for so long. So when I heard about the party from the classmates, I agreed to meet them there. I rarely passed up an opportunity to attend a party, but not for the reasons most would understand. College parties offered some of the best people watching in town. The gatherings were just like virtual masterclass in social interaction and featured every type of behavioral observation imaginable. Attending them was like getting a jolt of feeling by osmosis. The bigger the party, the easier it was for me. I'd arrive and then disappear into the flood of the strangers, revealing my invisibility. Sometimes I'd find a chair in the corner and just sit. Other times I'd wander around. Goers with their animated responses and emotional reactions were just wildly different from me, but so interesting. Watching them helped me identify the right facial expressions to use and the proper way to react to others, and all with minimal personal interaction. It was like being an emotional anthropologist. She is just too funny. After a week of partying like this, I discovered something important. An internal emotion wasn't requisite to produce an external reaction. I didn't need to feel something to react as if I did. As long as I could just match the proper physical response to the proper circumstance, I could act like everyone else. I could mimic the correct behavior. It was the first time I'd realized this. Growing up, I'd often looked to my younger sister for emotional cues. It's how I was able to mostly fly under the radar thus far, by playing the good girl, by playing the sister. The problem was that this disguise never seemed to fit. Harlow, with her vast emotional depths and limitless empathy, was just nothing like me. Adopting her personality was like wearing a dress that was 2 sizes too small. It was manageable for a little while, but not for long. What I needed was diversity. Personality stitched together to create a bespoke psychological disguise. And now, finally, I have the material. Going to college parties was like gaining access to an unlimited amount of fabric with which you could just craft my disguise. I experimented with as many emotions as I could, then alerted the most suitable ones to fit. Alone in my dorm, I practiced mannerisms I'd picked up from people that I saw at the parties. Once I had them perfected, I tested them on live subjects. The results were just astonishing. I learned that touching someone on the arm during a conversation quickly rendered them more comfortable. I also learned that starting any conversation with a compliment or an unexpected question was the easiest way to solve a mistake. I began to implicate these practices in my daily life and was astounded by the immediate differences. For the first time, people seemed to be warm to me authentically, that there was nothing authentic about my interactions, but that didn't matter. Classmates were suddenly eager to chat up with me on campus. Dorm mates were stopping by my room to socialize. These changes, hardly noticeable to anyone else, were extremely powerful to me. They were like breadcrumbs leading me down a path towards social inclusion. To be clear, it wasn't approval that I craved, it was integration. Okay. I didn't want to stand out in a crowd. My entire life, I'd wanted to disappear. But once I got to all wrong. The trick to going unnoticed was not to isolate, but to infiltrate, to simulate. By assuming the personalities of other people, I was no longer getting to the look. Dishonesty, once again, had proven to be the safest choice. Hidden behind my personality fabrics, I was, for all intents and purposes, invisible. This was a huge breakthrough. I hated the people always sensed that I was somehow different. It made me more conspicuous. It made me easier to spot. But now I had the tools. Whatever it was about me that made others uncomfortable no longer mattered. I'm sorry, guys, the phone's ringing. One moment. One moment. Hello? Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Okay. Yes, ma'am, you will. Okay. All right. Bye-bye. Well, now that was really good news. I'm so glad to hear that. My sister, I talked about this before, but my sister, okay, I suffered with, let me turn this down over here. Hang on. An eye problem. And so she thinks that she's got the same eye problem. So I got into this study where I was able to get help with it, and it's macular degeneration. So she's going to join the study as well and come in next week when I go to the doctor next time. So I'm very excited about that. So anyway, let me get back to where I was. Okay. Where were we? Okay. She's about her breakthrough. Okay. The second so we're back over here. She goes, this was a huge breakthrough. I hated the people always sensed there was something different about me. It made me more conspicuous. And whatever it was about me that made others uncomfortable no longer mattered. I could simply distract them by impersonating them. It was like casting a spell. The second I'd meet someone new, I'd adopt their stance, imitate their mannerisms, copy their cadence, and then project them as my own. The effect was like holding up a giant mirror. Men, women, old, young, it didn't matter. People were always charmed, not by me, but by my reflection of them. All I had to do was mimic behaviors I was observing and also practicing at various social gatherings. Granted, my approach to the learning process had to be adjusted from time to time. At fraternity parties, for example, I learned that sitting in the corner staring at the people and scribbling observations on a legal pad didn't exactly help my cause. Usually, the only reactions I'd get or I'd observe from that viewpoint were the ones of extreme discomfort. So instead of watching the people where I could be seen, I just sought out a where I could just eavesdrop and or observe unnoticed through a window or a door. Eventually, I began to rate the frat parties based on their venues by layout, rather than considering the physical attributes of their pledges. I ranked them by the sneak factors or their common rooms. I knew that Delta House, for instance, was older, larger, and set back from the road. This offered far more hiding opportunities than, say, the Phi Kappa Phi House, which was smaller and didn't have any ground level exterior front windows. I even kept a list noticing the best places to hide next to the names of the nearly every Greek house at UCLA. Let me adjust my glasses. I have a hard time with this today. My favorite spot was the dining room at Sigma Phi Epsilon. It had interior pocket doors with windows that allowed for mostly unrestricted views into other common areas, as well as floor-to-ceiling glass sliders looked out onto the backyard. As long as the doors were closed and the lights were off, I had two perspectives from which to watch the people for hours. The main reason I was so excited to attend the party was that Saturday was because it was the Sigma House. To me, people watching from my hiding place sounded like a delightful way to spend an evening. As soon as I arrived, I made a beeline for the dining room and to stake out my spot. But on the way there, I was knocked to the ground by a very drunk fraternity brother. "Oh no," he stammered, regaining his balance and awkwardly trying to help me up. "I'm so sorry. Are you okay?" "Yeah, it's no problem," I said, picking up my purse. "Well, I'm Steve," he said, his bleary eyes blinking slowly. Unlike most sober partygoers, I'd enjoy interacting with drunk people. Their recollection of me the next morning would be hazy at best. It was sort of like being a ghost. Stephen grinned and pointed at an unsteady finger at my chest. "Hey," he paused. "Don't I know you?" "No," I said, laughing. He goes, "Yeah," he continued. "If I hadn't answered, you're Sarah." I said nothing and was momentarily stunned when he pressed his body to mine and my back against the wall of the hallway. Steve's lips grazed my ear. He goes, "Guess what?" he whispered. "I'm out of cigarettes. Go get us some," he mumbled, "and I'll owe you forever." He took a clumsy step backwards and pressed a set of keys into my palm. I stood there, unsure what to do, mistaking my confusion for reluctance. Steve nodded and waved a finger at me again in some unspoken understanding that I had no part of. "Right," he stirred, reaching into his pocket, handing me this thick wallet. "Gotcha. Get whatever you want," Steve said. He grinned and turned to stumble back down the hall toward the living room. There he collapsed onto the couch into a fit of semi-consciousness. So he just handed her over his wallet and his keys and said, "Just go on to the store, get whatever you want." Okay, and so therefore she's stealing a car. I had looked at the keys and the wallet in my hand only moments before I'd planned on spending the evening sitting alone in the dark room, watching the other people interact. And that was fine, but this was so much better. It was easy enough to find the car. I raised the keys above my head and wandered through the parking lot, pressing the unlock on the fob. Eventually, the lights of Steve's Acura just blinked from the corner of the parking space. I opened the door and tossed my purse and Steve's wallet inside. Easing myself into the driver's seat, I slipped the key into the ignition as I sat for a moment, basking in my unexpected good fortune. Then I started to drive. I took Sunset toward the beach, and I turned north along the Pacific Coast Highway, where I just cruised next to the ocean for miles and miles. When I reached the mountains hugging the Malibu coastline, I took a right and just crossed through the Calabasas into the suburbs of San Fernando Valley. I cruised along Ventura Boulevard for nearly an hour, and then cut through the whole Hollywood Hills before making my way into the flats of Beverly Hills and back to the UCLA campus. It was almost 2 a.m. when I finally stopped at a store. I figured it was a smart thing to do. I grabbed a sleeve of Starburst and I headed for the counter. The cigarettes were low glass cabinet behind the cash register. I asked the cashier for the brand that matched the empty packs I'd seen crumpled on the floor of his car and handed him Steve's credit card. I didn't think he would ask me to see my ID, but to be safe, I distracted him with some charm. I leaned forward and nonchalantly tapped the back of his hand against his wrist. Listen to this. I leaned forward and nonchalantly tapped the back of my hand against his wrist, staring him directly in the eyes. I said, "What's the craziest thing you've ever seen? While working here." I asked generally, she was genuinely curious. The clerk was caught off guard. The craziest thing, he ran the card through the scanner and handed it back to me, deep in thought. Then his face lit up. "Oh, one time I helped a lady get away from a guy chasing her," he said. Holy shit. Okay, so I have to do some trigger warnings because there are some bad words in this book, but this is just the way she wrote it, right? "Holy shit," I said, truly and surprised. "Good for you." I grabbed the cigarettes and called, "Have a great night," just over my shoulder as I left. A short time later, I carefully pulled the Acura back into its spot on Fraternity Row. I knew my advantage was over, but couldn't bring myself to open the door. The vehicle felt like a decompression chamber. Driving around town in Steve's car was exhilarating, just the pop of emotional color I craved. I sat still in the darkness and noticed as the feeling gradually dissipated. The effort relaxed me almost to the point of drowsiness. I settled into the seat. U2, The Joshua Tree, played from Steve's CD player. I closed my eyes and quickly constructed my version of one of the verses. "She will suffer the feeling thrill. She's running to stand still." That's exactly what it felt like, as though my yearning to force a pop of color wasn't about emotion at all. It was designed to exhaust my experience of emotions so I could stand still, to experience apathy without pressure or stuck stress. So, if right now I feel comfortable, apathetic, amused, then what tips the scale? What causes it to become uncomfortable? I thought of how stuck stress always accompanied the pressure and the claustrophobic type of anxiety it so closely resembled. Then I shook my head in the mounting frustration. How could someone feel anxiety and apathy at the same time? I was in too good a mood to think about it. Forcing these questions from my mind, I gazed drowsily out the window, and I rested there contently for a few more minutes before finally pulling the keys from the ignition. I tossed them along with the cigarettes and the wallet onto the passenger seat. Then I got out and walked back to my dorm, already thinking about how I could do it again. It didn't take long for me to concord a plan. Boy, I'm telling you, she's a little bit bad, but she is funny. The spontaneous joyride was the first of many. In the months that followed, I went on dozens of nocturnal trips, although after they were decidedly more deliberate. I found that I wasn't as listless on the days when I knew I'd soon be cruising the city in a car that wasn't mine. It wasn't so much that the act itself, but the anticipation of the thrill that made my pressure decrease. Once I understood the driving force behind my compulsions, that, like Dr. Slack said, I was subconsciously motivated to do something, anything, to elevate my apathetic baseline. I was less concerned about them. They had become normal. Normalization is the therapeutic tool through which a state of mind or a belief system previously thought of an anomalies or irregulars is defined as normal. Dr. Slack explained this as she underlined the word on her chalkboard: normalizing mental disorders. Specifically, the various symptoms of mental disorders is essentially to counteracting the stigma associated with those symptoms and replacing it with knowledge and eventually acceptance. This explanation just resounded with me deeply and resulted in just critical shift in my own psychological awareness. Although I recognized that my destructive urges were not normal in the general sense, I learned that they were typical for people like me. So I'm not crazy, I thought. The belief was both unexpected and overwhelming. Although I never let it dominate my consciousness, some parts of me had always been uneasy with the difference of my personality type. The worst part was not understanding any of it, especially my destructive urges. Now that I had some idea of what provoked them, my reaction to them became much easier to manage. Although all I had to do was hold out for the weekend. On Friday and Saturday nights, Almost all the UCLA Greek organizations would hold massive parties just along the frat road. I'd wander the narrow street in search of the house with the loudest and most disorganized party. Then I would go inside, zero in on a drunken resident, and find a way to definitely separate him from his car keys. Sometimes I'd drive fast, other times I'd drive slow. Some nights I'd travel far, other nights I'd only go a few blocks. The only consistent thing about those trips was that the relief that came from them just easing the stress of my apathy. She goes, relief that came from I'm sorry, let me reread that. The only consistent thing about those trips was the relief that came from easing the stress of apathy and the comfort that came from the knowledge that I'd found a reliable, albeit temporary, solution. I understood the potential consequences of my behavior. If I get caught in a prolonged automobile, arrest and even jail time were very plausible outcomes, but I wasn't bothered. That's the problem with people like me, I thought, as I pulled a sleek BMW through the takeout lane of the Westwood Inn, and it's the In-N-Out Burger. We don't care. Incarceration wasn't something I feared. It was almost an incentive. I remembered how something I feared. I remembered just how safe from themselves Officer Bobby and the prisoners were. A short stint in lockup sounded interesting. Wow, that's a little bit odd, isn't it? Without anything to stimulate me and no way to leave, I wondered, would I still crave emotional pops of color? Or would my black and white internal world become easier to manage? Part of me wanted to find out. However, I knew I wasn't likely to be caught. None of the guys would ever report their cars as stolen. In most cases, the keys were just given willingly, if not soberly. They were always too drunk at the time to even remember owning a car, much less notice their car was gone, and that I had taken it. I already knew how to explain things. Here are your chips, handsome. I threw a bag of Doritos at my most recent victim, who was sprawled on top of a beanbag in the living room of his frat house. He opened his eyes, he rubbed his forehead, trying to desperately focus. He goes, "Hey, pretty," and he mumbled, smiling, "Where'd you go?" "To get you some chips like you asked." I just replied sweetly and bent down to peck him on the cheek. "Here's your keys." I tossed them at him. "See you later." As with every unwitting victim, I had no interest in chatting with this boy. I was tired and relaxed from my joyriding. All I wanted was to head back to my dorm and go to bed. I managed to get out of the door before he had a chance to catch me. Oh boy, she is something else. Get my foot out of there. Oh boy, as the night air was chilly, but I didn't care. It reminded me of the time I walked home from the San Francisco slumber party. The streets were empty and the houses were sleepy. The night was full of possibilities. When I got to my dorm, I bypassed the front door. I'd missed curfew, and after midnight, all the exterior doors were locked. The only way to get into was to call the resident advisor. Naturally, I had no intention of alerting anyone about my nocturnal schedule. Before I left that night, I'd made other arrangements. I've always made sure the window in the maintenance closet at the back of the building was unlocked. I placed my hand on the glass and gave it a gentle push. Then I lifted the sash, hoisted myself onto the ledge, and crawled inside. The first floor was dark as I made my way to the stairs. Climbing quickly to the second level, I tiptoed across the landing to my room. Fluorescent panels flooded the hallways in the harsh light, and I opened the door as carefully as I could, not wanting to wake my roommate. Kimmy hated my late-night excursions. She had let me know on numerous occasions. She was a light sleeper, she'd explained through her translator. The slightest noise would wake her. Unfortunately, that was the least of my concerns that night. The hallway lights were just stadium grade compared to the darkness of our room. I didn't make a sound when I entered, but the aggressive overhead beams stormed ahead of me, illuminating the room and jolting Kimmy awake. Her hands flew to her eyes as if they burned. "Jesus," I said, making no secret of my disdain. The drama. I pulled the door shut and whispered several apologies as I climbed into my top bunk, but they fell on foreign ears. In the bed below, I could hear my roommate grumbling furiously in Mandarin as she tossed and turned. It made me smile. Kimmy, I knew, was going to request a meeting. She loves to cause trouble. Oh, she's funny. She's absolutely funny. Let me take a drink. Tell you, I really never thought this book would, would be this funny, but it absolutely is funny. She's a very funny writer. Let's go ahead and read chapter 9. We'll get through chapter 9. Well, let me see how many pages chapter 9 is, because today I have some other things I have to do. I've already been on here for 40 minutes because, it just takes a while. Well, okay, I'm going to start reading chapter 9. I might not make it the whole way through because I really only have let me see what time it is. About an hour and a half to spare today. All right. Little earthquakes. You broke curfew. You woke me up again. This is inconsiderate, the machine says without it. After my most recent joyride, and Kimmy and I were sitting across from each other at our desk. The machine occupied a neutral position on the chair between us. My roommate didn't like living with me, and I understood why. We were polar opposites. Kimmy hated that I didn't seem to adhere to any moral code and that I repeatedly broke our dorm's many rules. Even minor infractions would send her into a fury. These tantrums would usually take place during roommate chats. She insisted on having at least monthly. When Kimmy wanted to have one of her meetings, she'd let me know by writing talk, along with some options for dates and times on a Post-it. And then she'd affix that note to my remote. This was always done while I was asleep. Of course it was. Waking up one of Kimmy's Post-its was not unlike Waking up to one of Kimmy's Post-its was not unlike being visited by the tooth fairy. I positively lived in these talks, and not just because I was entertained by confrontation, although this was certainly the case. The main reason I loved our meetings was interacting with the machine, because Kimmy couldn't speak English, nor I couldn't speak Mandarin. The device became an unwitting mediator to our talks, and one that I decided was secretly on my side. That's funny. I know, I replied earnestly as I shifted slightly in my chair, but it was unavoidable. I had to return. She knew that this Kimmy was going to be mad and that Kimmy would put this Post-it note and she was going to have to deal with this. But again, she doesn't care. She doesn't have that same feelings that we have. So Kimmy appeared confused by what the translator was reporting. She looked at the machine and then at me and the back of the machine. She shook her head and pointed at a list of dorm rules and regulations that she had taped above her desk, particularly screaming in Chinese as it tried to get into the conversation back on track. Midnight, said the machine evenly. You arrived in the dorm at 3:51. You woke me up again. I could not sleep. You must do Greenpeace. Okay. I rolled my eyes. It wasn't the accusations, but her mentions of the charity that irritated me. For some reason, Kimmy's chats often included a man that I donate to one of the environmental organizations where she worked as a volunteer. It was her way of suggesting I needed to atone for my indiscretions. Fuck Greenpeace, I said quietly. Machine reported my sentiments back to Kimmy, who reacted like I'd slapped her in the face. Wait, no, I interjected, glaring at the machine. I'm sorry, Kimmy. I wasn't serious. The translator began to chirp my apologies, but Kimmy wouldn't hear it. She covered her face with her hands and shook her head back and forth. Why don't you care? She exclaimed. I was taken aback. Not only had she uttered the sentence, but she had said it directly to me. I was momentarily speechless as the machine shouted Kimmy's own words back to her in Mandarin. It's okay, machine. I interrupted. Take it easy. The machine began to chirp again, and I tried not to laugh. I loved making the machine speak in the third person, even if I couldn't understand it. Look, I'm really sorry, I said, once the machine was finished. I didn't mean to wake you up. I won't come in late anymore, at least not on the weekdays. I promise, I mean it. Kimmy seemed pacified for what I certain was markedly a softer tone, exhilarated by the machine, and it's translated my attempt at sincerity. She exhaled dramatically. Oh my goodness. Can you imagine that? Do you believe me? I asked. Kimmy nodded. Upon hearing the machine's translations, confident meetings was over. I stood and asked to shake her hand, but Kimmy gently grabbed me up by my arm. She stared at me, she stared at me, eyes wide and imploring. Why don't you care? She asked again. To hear it spoken aloud now twice, the question I'd asked myself 1,000 times, was strangely ominous. The room seemed to shrink, and I slowly shook my head. I wanted the answer. I don't know. I stammered it was the truth. Kimmy nodded in an unexpected display of compassion. She squeezed my arm affectionately, and then stood up and gestured to the clock. It's dinner time. The machine translated for her. Will you join me? I nodded, grateful for the change in the subject. Sure, I said. Just let me go get changed. Kimmy pointed down, indicating that she would meet me in the lobby, and then she picked up the machine and left. Engulfed by the silence, I felt grateful to be in sync once again with my environment. The balcony doors were open, and a beam of sunlight had bathed in the room. I watched as the dust. This is funny. I watched as the dust motes passed through the light and sparkled like diamonds. Apple, too, washed over me, and I allowed it. The effect was hypnotizing. Why? I wondered aloud. Why don't you care? It was time to find out. The next day, I paid a visit to the psychology section at UCLA's library. I'd like to see everything you have on Sociopath, please, I told the librarian. The woman looked disappointed after typing the word into her computer terminal. She had shocking red hair and wore a wrap dress that matched her pair of long, dangly earrings. A name tag on her lapel read Shelley. I don't think we have much on sociopath, she said. It's sort of an outdated term. She stood and motioned to me to follow as she walked back to the larger stack of books, back on the far wall. In fact, she said, I'm not even sure it's in the DSM. What's the DSM? I asked, just trotting alongside. Shelley stopped to pick up a large tomy from one of the shelves. What in the world? A large tomy from one of the shelves. She leafed through its pages. The Diagnosis and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, she told me. It's basically the Bible of psychology. Doctors use it for assessments. Insurance companies use it for billing and treatments. Every mental disorder you can think of is in the book, along with the descriptions and diagnosis. Shelley frowned after scanning the books and sides, but not sociopathy. I stared at the tiny print. Once again, I saw where the word should have been, right between social phobia and somatization disorders, but it was missing, just like the dictionaries. I muttered. Shelley looked. The word sociopath, I said, is not even in some dictionaries? Really? Really, but the word obviously exists, right? I mean, we just had a lecture on it in my psych class. It definitely exists, Shelley says. Nodding, she ran her hand across several books before pulling another copy of the DSM from the shelves. This is an older edition. I bet it's in here. She scanned its index and then flipped to the pages and she found it. Yep. She handed the open book to me. Sociopathic personality disturbance. It just gleamed in bold black print at the top of the page, and I looked at Shelley confused. So it used to be in the DSM, but now it's not? I shook my head. Why would they take it out? Well, it was replaced with antisocial personality disorder. She replied, but I don't think that the diagnosis criteria are the same. Shelley pointed to an empty table. Have a seat, she said. I'll see what else I can find. Well, I sat down, set the open book in front of me, and began to read. This term applies to individuals who manifest disregards for their unusual... Oh my goodness. This term applies to individuals who manifest disregard for the usual social code of them as the result of having lived all their lives in an abnormal moral environment. They may be capable of strong loyalties. These individuals typically do not show significant personality deviations other than those implied by adherence to those values or code of their own predatory, criminal, or other social groups. I took a short inhale. The description may as well have been a picture next to me. But what did it mean? Was I really a sociopath? I'd suspected as much, but now that I had an actual definition, what was I supposed to do about it? My mind was racing with implications of my self-diagnosis when Shelley returned with another book, The Mask of Sanity. I said, reading the corner had been written by a University of Georgia psychiatrist named Hervey Cleckley in 1941. I'm still looking, said Shelby, but check this out. She opened the book to a section near the back. This is one that's technically about psychopaths. She said, but the checklist inside is used a lot for sociopaths. They're sort of the same. See, we've learned they're not the same. Remember in other books that we've read about between the differences between sociopaths and psychopaths, they are not the same, but the words are used a lot interchangeably, most of the time wrongly when you start describing these people, right? We've talked about that before. So anyway, let me fix this book here. Oh, these pages are stuck together. But she's kind of funny here. I guess this is when she learns exactly what she is, but not sure what to do with it. But she still needs to be properly diagnosed. We know that, right? Wait, I said, shaking my head. So sociopaths and psychopaths and antisocial people are all lumped together? I'm not really sure, replied Shelley, but antisocial personality disorder is the only one in the diagnostic manual. The current edition, yes, she said, in the latest DS at the desk. I grabbed it for you. Well, it covers hundreds of mental disorders, plus there's a glossary. But nothing about sociopaths, I said. The librarian frowned. It's strange, I'll admit. She pointed to the Mask of Sanity. Start with this, and I'll keep looking. Shelley left me alone with a new book. On top of the cover about psychopathy, the words clinical profile were printed in bold. Beneath them was a list of personality characteristics. I scanned the list quickly, my confusion growing with each tinge of the familiarity. She was seeing herself. Number 1, superficial charm and good intelligence. Number 2, absence of delusions and other signs of irrational thinking. Number 3, absence of nervousness or psychoneuronic manifestations. Unreliability, untruthfulness and insincerity, lack of remorse or shame, inadequately motivated antisocial behaviors, poor judgment and failure to learn by experience, pathological egocentricities and incapacity for love, general poverty and major affective reactions, specific loss of insight, unresponsive and general interpersonal relations, a fantastic and uninventing behavior with drink and sometimes without, suicide rarely carried out, sex life is impersonal, trivial, follow any life plan. What the hell? I wondered out loud. Those traits were even more, this is funny. She goes, those traits were even more description of me. That means I was a psychopath or a sociopath. None of this made any sense. What was the difference? I returned to the current version of the DSM and found the section on antisocial personality disorders. The delicate pages made sharp, snapping sounds as I turned them. The diagnostic criteria for antisocial personality disorder. I read a persuasive pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of others occurring since age 15 years, as indicated by 3 or more of the following. This is just making me laugh. I'm so sorry, guys. I'm just trying to get through it, but it's so funny. Failure to conform to social norms with respect to lawful behaviors as indicated by repeatedly performing acts that are grounds for arrest. Notice she's taking cars. She's having a good time taking cars, remember. Deceitfulness is indicated by repeatedly lying, using aliases, or using aliases or conning others for personal profit or pleasure. Impulsivity or failure to plan ahead. Irritability and aggressive as indicated by repeated physical fights and assaults. Reckless disregard for safety of self or others. Consistent irresponsibility as indicated by repeated failure to sustain constant work, behavior, or honor financial obligations. Lack of remorse as indicated by being indifferent to rationalizing having hurt, mistreated, or stolen from another. Shelby was right. I thought antisocial personality disorder was different from sociopathy, at least based in the diagnostic list. Certainly, there were similarities between the two, but the criteria for each was just distinctive. Well, I could easily identify with most of the traits on the sociopathic and the psychopathic checklist. I was only able to relate to about half of the antisocial ones. So, why, I wondered, what was the point of replacing sociopathy with antisocial personality disorder if the two aren't diagnostically the same? Why isn't sociopathy in the manual? And how are sociopaths different from psychopaths? She goes, oh my gosh, I gotta fix my eye real quick. It's making my eye get dry. Sometimes it just happens, but anyway. So I wondered, she goes, so I wondered, what's the point of replacing these? She goes, if the two aren't diagnostically the same, why isn't sociopathy in the manual, and how a sociopath is different from psychopaths? I sat there wondering where I might find the answers. Then it dawned on me. Dr. Slack, she taught a course about psychology. At the very least, she could point me to the right directions, Scooping up the books, I walked back to the information counter where Shelley sat preoccupied behind the desk. Hey, I said, setting the books on the ledge. Thanks for getting these for me. I'll probably be back. I just want to run a few things by my professor. The librarian shook her head and slowly, and then gave me a confused look. Let me turn the page here. It's the craziest thing, she said. In front of her were several old dictionaries. Sociopath, she said, you're right. I can't find the definition anywhere. The following week, I made an appointment to meet with Dr. Slack. Her small, cozy office was located on the ground floor of the psychology building. Thanks for coming in, Patrick, she greeted me warmly. How can I help you? First of all, I said, returning to the smile, I love your lecture on sociopathy. It was fascinating. In fact, I've decided to write my term paper on it. The compliment, although calculated, was sincere. I liked Dr. Slack, and I enjoyed the feeling I got from letting her know, as if I was speaking out from a hiding place. The problem is I'm having trouble narrowing my focus. The research on sociopaths is extremely limited, and I went to the library. They told me that it isn't even in the DSM anymore. That's right, she confirmed. They replaced it with antisocial personality disorder. But why, if the diagnostics aren't the same? She nodded appreciatively and leaned back in her chair. It's a good question, she said, a hint of a surprise in her voice. Why don't you tell me what you think? I reached into my bag and pulled out the DSM I'd lifted from the library, and she stole a book while she's in the library. Yes, she stole the book while she was in the library. Here, I said, opening the book. These are the diagnostics for antisocial personality disorder, right? But look at them, Dr. Slack. He scanned the page. The only one based on personality is the lack of remorse. I continued, everything else is like behavioral, failure to conform to social norms, deceitfulness. All of these are about behaviors. So, she says, I tipped my head forward as if the answer was obvious. So it seems unreliable, like how do we know all sociopaths act like that? Well, she said, after a significant pause, having antisocial personality diagnosis doesn't automatically mean that someone is a sociopath. It means more of an indicator. More psychologists agree that an antisocial personality assessment is only the first step in diagnosing someone as a sociopath. But that doesn't make any sense, I said, shaking my head. Well, why not? I took a deep breath because I said, in order to be diagnosed as an antisocial, you need to have been labeled a criminal and at a very young age. You have to have been arrested or been expelled from school, not just once, but multiple times. It says so right here. I pointed to the book. There has to be evidence of conduct disorders. But in order to have evidence of a conduct disorder, you have to get caught exhibiting such conduct. Right, said Dr. Slack. I threw up my hands. Well, what about the ones not getting caught? I asked. What about sociopaths who are more disciplined, better at controlling themselves? I continued, you're telling me the only way to get diagnosed as a sociopath is to first be diagnosed with conduct disorders. I frowned. That doesn't make sense, I said. Then that would mean that all sociopaths would have criminal records, and there's no way that's true. Dr. Slack thought about this and then nodded in agreement. It's an interesting observation. I pulled some notes from my bag. You said in class that many mental disorders are diagnosed on a spectrum, right? I wrote it down, like autism. Some cases are more extreme than others, right? Well, what if sociopathy is like that too? I asked. What if only a handful of sociopaths are extreme types and the ones getting arrested and are expelled? Sociopaths as a spectrum disorder, yes. It's a unique theory, she said, smiling. At very least, I think we've narrowed the focus on your paper. Only I wasn't done. And what about this? I said. Again, I reached into my bag and I took out the Mask of Sanity and flipped to the list of traits that I had read in the library. This book is about psychopaths. I said, tapping on the page, but the librarian told me that the traits used to diagnose sociopaths. Yes, said Dr. Slack, that's true. So I don't understand, I said. What's the difference? Biology, she said. At least that's what many researchers think. Psychopaths are believed to suffer from brain abnormalities, right? It's why they make the same mistakes over and over. They are biologically incapable of learning from punishment and understanding remorse or even experiencing anxiety. But sociopaths are believed to be different. While their behavior is often just as bad as the psychopaths, they appear to be more capable of evolution. Their issue seems to be more environment than biological, Dr. Slack shrugged. At least that's one of the theories, but there's a lot of disagreements in this field. Well, have you ever read anything about a sociopathic pressure? I asked, because I read somewhere that sociopaths experience this feeling of tension. I lied. like a pressure rising, and then the only way for them to make it stop is to do something bad. Dr. Slack reached for a pen. Well, that's fascinating, she said. Where did you hear that? I don't remember, I shrugged. I just thought it made more sense. Maybe the pressure is the same as the subconscious drive you just discussed in class. That's caused by a sociopath's desire to feel. If that's the case, then it makes sense that the destructive behaviors of a sociopath might be motivated by the same way the repetitive behaviors of someone with OCD. I paused and asked, what do you think? Now that you mention it, I'm positive I've read research on sociopathy and increased anxiety, she said. Something like that could make for a fascinating study. It would be interesting to know whether there are correlations to destructive acts. Stuck stress, I thought. But again, she added, anxiety would most likely only be present among sociopaths, not psychopaths. We think psychopaths aren't capable of psychopatronic manifestations, at least according to the Cluckley's list. Now, Cluckley is the person that wrote this other book, right? Remember the traits that she went and read the traits? It's out of that book. Wow. So, how can you tell whether someone is a sociopath or a psychopath? I tentatively asked, is there a test or something? The professor nodded. Yes, she claimed. The clinicians use the PCL if they think they're dealing with a psychopath. What's that? The psychopathy checklist, sometimes called the psychopath test. She pointed to the Mask of Sanity. The criteria is based on this book, actually. Lack of remorse is an obvious indicator, but social emotions play a key part as well. I furrowed my brow, confused. What do you mean? She stood and crossed to one of the bookcases that framed her desk. Do you remember in class when we talked about Plunchik's and the primary emotions? I did. Robert Plunchik was a psychologist who identified 8 fundamental feelings that he termed the primary emotions: anger, fear, sadness, disgust, surprise, anticipation, trust, and joy. I recall the day we learned about them, and I'd written them on a piece of paper and later forced and experiment my own. Sorry, guys. Let me see. What does it say here? Get some light. I need a little more light here. She goes, I'd recall the day we learned about them. I'd written them on a piece of paper and later forced myself to match an experience of my own to the corresponding feelings. In the end, when I was able to successfully complete the entire list, I felt relieved. Yes, I said, nodding. Everyone is born with the same set of basic emotions. Right, she continued. Even psychopaths. These emotions are automatic, inherent. Dr. Slack selected a binder and returned to her desk. But there's another set of feelings that is non-inherent. She set the binder down in front of me, gesturing to open the page. Empathy, guilt, shame, remorse, jealousy, even love. These are considered social emotions, she said. We're not born with them. They're learned. Okay, well, sociopaths and psychopaths both struggle to connect with the social emotions, she said. Some researchers believe they aren't capable. Wait, I interrupted. Aren't capable or limited. I shifted in my seat, eager to ask the right questions. You said sociopaths didn't have the same biological limitations as psychopaths. I pressed. So could it be that sociopaths aren't incapable, but just have a harder time, like an emotional learning disability? Emotional learning disability, Dr. Slack gave me a quizzical glance. Where did you hear that? I just figured that there's nothing. Then maybe their problem is just related to learning, dyslexia, but with feelings. Well, it's definitely a unique take. I'm used Dr. Slack, but I'm not sure it matters with regard to treatment. What do you mean? I asked. Why not? Dr. Slack leaned forward slightly. Human beings have a hard time living without access to emotion, she said. Apathy has apparently is profound. Although dramatically under-examined, it's just an impact on the psyche. She tilted her head. Think about it. What happens when which has evolved over millions of years to thrive based in small part on its ability to acknowledge and feel emotions, cannot access or interpret them? It must be frustrating, like the phantom limb syndrome. I didn't follow. It's something that frequently occurs with amputees. She explained, a sensation coming from a part of the body that's no longer there. She waited for me to make a connection before continuing. Sociopaths aren't missing a limb, but we think that the neural pathways that handle the processing to the more complex emotions are somehow misconfigured. It's as if the emotions aren't there, just a little bit out of reach, like they're there, but a little bit out of reach. The professor raised her eyebrows. Wouldn't that be a maddening and as trying, wait a minute, she goes, wouldn't that be as maddening as trying to scratch a foot that isn't there? I nodded slowly as my thoughts drifted to the pressure I'd have been experiencing my whole life. Maddening, I said. Psychopaths and sociopaths are in the same boat because they're constantly looking for a way to they're constantly looking for a way to connect their pathways, to feel. It's why they behave destructively. It's why they're so dangerous. Eventually, the constant weight of apathy becomes too much to take. And then what happened? Well, Dr. Slack frowned. They snapped. That's when the bad things happen, I guess. Later that night, I sat alone, motionless at my desk. It had been hours since I'd returned from meeting with Dr. Slack, and the sun had long since disappeared behind the West Hills. Streetlights from the avenue below just had bathed the room in just the shadows. I stared blankly through the glass panes at the balcony. I'm sorry, guys. I gotta get a drink. She's just funny but terrible. But I guess she's finally getting an understanding of, exactly what's wrong with her and where it came from and how it started and, all that stuff. So I don't know, but anyway, here we go. I need more light. It's a little dark in here. When my eyes, sometimes if it's too dark, I just can't, so here we go. The reason why I can't go to Pig Fest with everybody for our precious little is off. So I'm gonna have my cataract surgery then, so that I can see better. So as we're reading, I don't have so many mistakes. So here we go. Let's go ahead and keep going here. Later, I have to start over right here. Later that night, I sat alone and motionless at my desk. It had been hours since I'd returned from my meeting with Dr. Slack, and the sun had long since disappeared behind the West Hills. Streetlights from the avenue below just bathed the room in the shadows as I stared blankly through the glass panes at my balcony doors. I felt hopeless. I stood and just walked into the doors, pulling them open. The balcony was decorated barely a foot wide, hands and squeezing my foot onto the ledge. A cool breeze whipped my hair. While I stood there, I became aware that my hopelessness was transforming into something more familiar. Surrender, I whispered. However actively I was experiencing it, I was also separated from it, detached and attached at the same time. It was the way I felt after I'd locked the girls in the elementary school bathroom. That experience had always made me curious just how far I could go to such detachment. I had a sneaking suspicion I already knew I could snap. I'd always known I was capable of violence and, worse, that I was internally rewarded for it. I'd known it ever since the day I'd stabbed Sid and felt that rush of feeling course through that feeling that just coursed through me. The temptation to hurt was always there, a blinking cursor on a computer screen just waiting for input. But, like with that cat in Virginia, I had always pushed it back. I'd always resisted because I'd always hoped, but Dr. Slack had said there was no hope. So what if that's the true? What if that's true? I wondered, what then? Dr. Slack was right. This life, this endless quest for feeling against the crushing weight of apathy was exhausting. It reminded me of the title of one of my favorite albums, Little Earthquakes by Tori Amos. That's why my behaviors were little earthquakes generated to relieve pressure and prevent the big one. Normalization or not, the management of my symptoms was a continuance and balancing act of light and dark, and that needed constant discipline. And I wasn't sure how long I could do it if there was no hope. Everyone else had access to hope. Schizophrenia, alcoholics, bipolar depressions. There was treatment plans and support groups for all of them. The DSM was full of mental disorders and personality types, all which included specific information and diagnostic insights, no matter how strange. There was even a term for people who compulsively ate things like couch cushions. Sorry, this is funny. Oh my God. Okay, let me try to get through this. It's funny. There was even a term for people who compulsively ate things like couch cushions or paper clips. We'd learned about it in class. It was an eating disorder called pica and its own 1-800 number. But sociopaths? Nothing, I whispered to myself. I'd gotten my wish. I was invisible, at least as far as my diagnosis was concerned, but I was also alone. While my dorm mates were in class, I was breaking into their rooms and rifling through their belongings to see what secrets they were keeping. While my girlfriends were going on dates, I was stealing cars. Is this all there is for me? I just thought helplessly. My destructive urges hadn't gone away when I got to college. The pressure and the stress just hadn't receded. I was no closer to normal. If anything, my problems had become magnified. Was this all I had to look forward to for the rest of my life? Intimate isolation and a steady increase of abnormal or just amoral behaviors just to keep my dangerous impulses at bay? All the books in the library pointed to an antisocial behavior as a symptom of my personality type, but none of them explained why. Why was I superficially charming and prone to lying? Let me see how many more pages. Oh, we're almost through with this chapter. Good. Why did I feel the constant pressure to do bad things? And why was there so much stress attached to the pressure? Why did unacceptable behavior restore my internal equilibrium? Why was I so frequently The researchers and psychologists responsible for the diagnostics hadn't provided a single theory to explain the apathy. Did they not know? Did they even want to know? Was their decision to remove sociopathy from the reference books the only evidence I needed that my personality type was just a lost cause? I was nauseous just thinking about it. I find my gaze on the ground, then adjusted the grip on the railings and swung my leg over so my body was on the other side. My arm was stretched behind me as I leaned forward. I didn't know where my apathy ended any more than I knew where it began. But I knew where it would take me, certainly, if I ever gave into one of the many more violent impulses. It would be no little earthquake, that I knew for sure. When it was all over, after the blood had settled to the rush and the rush feeling was gone, it was likely that I would either be dead or in jail. Either way, though, I would no longer have to fight. Fuck it, I said. I'll let go of the railings, and for a second I was weightless. An eternity of stillness flashed across my consciousness before gravity took a hold and I started to fall. Although it was a brief in reality, the descent seemed to take a lifetime. The street below just rushed toward me. Instead of bracing myself for impact, I simply just closed my eyes. So be it, I thought, and then I hit the ground. Directly beneath the balcony was a small patch of grass that separated the concrete walkway from the carport. The thud, the sod absorbing most of the shock and knocking the air out of my lungs. I rolled from my chest onto my back to catch my breath. Staring up at the stars from my now horizontal position, I shook my head at the absurdity of my dramatic display. I hadn't even broken a nail. Jesus Christ, I said, struggling to sit up, and then I remembered the mask of sanity and certain traits on that checklist. Suicide rarely carried out. That was number 14 on there. I took a deep breath and I lay still for a few minutes, surrendering to the just mediocre predictability of what I had done. After a while, a car sped by and I came to my senses. I collected myself, stood up, and walked back to the building, just shaking my head at my ridiculous behavior. I found the maintenance window and pushed it open. Lowering myself inside, my internal climate just returned to all too familiar states of ambivalence. Only this time, I didn't fight. So maybe I am a sociopath. I thought as I stood inside the closet and closed the window behind me. Maybe I'm a psychopath. Maybe I'm just destined to spend the rest of my life dealing with these little earthquakes. I emerged from the maintenance room and strode down the hall into the corridor. Maybe I'll just have to work a little harder to do the right thing. I climbed the stairs to my floor. Maybe I won't maybe I won't get to live a normal life with normal people in a normal house, doing normal things. Maybe I won't get to make meaningful relationships. I reached the top of the landing and just marched to my room, unlocking the door with a spare key. I just kept it hidden at the top of the door frame. Maybe I won't experience college the way I am supposed to. I stepped inside. The stillness of the room was thick and soothing as the healing balm. I forced open the door, the French doors framing the balcony. They seemed less hopeless than they had a few minutes ago. Maybe I won't experience anything the way I'm supposed to. I walked to the ledge and stepped out again. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window, and I paused for a second, staring at the girl on the other side. So what, I asked her. If no one else can figure out what sociopathy is, then I'll figure it out for myself. And if that makes me hopeless and tired, and if that makes me lonely and a little sociopath, well, my voice just trailed off. I stared into the sky and I smiled. So be it. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. Chapter 9 is going to be next. Let me just go ahead and mark it right here. Put it right here for next up. Now she's in college. She jumps out of the dorm room window, lands on the ground, and gets up and walks. She's thinking to herself, I can't even do suicide correctly. Look at this. I can't even do that correctly. Anyway, I'm going to let y'all go for today. I don't know what happened I'm just trying to use this other channel, but it's just not working out very well. I got to figure out what I'm going to do about it. Anyway, you have a good day. Bye, guys. See you later. Let me get this turned off. Have a good day.